All right, Marina, welcome. Marina is the staff scientist at the Basque Center on Cognition, Brain and Language in San Sebastian in the Basque country. She holds a PhD from Lancaster in the UK and received her bachelor's and master's in linguistics, language and linguistics in El Paso in Texas. Now, Marina is great for various reasons. And the main reason, I think, to me, having invited her to this group, is that Marina is not only investigating the brain side of language, she does that well, and she's produced a very interesting body of work already. But what I think is really special about Marina is that she's also constantly checking her assumptions. She's investigating language as such as well, to really see whether the things that she puts into her experiments, they're really making sense. Yeah, and for her, what she's studying is language acquisition. And so she's studying both how the developing brain does that, and then also how actually the stimulus looks that those infants have to acquire. And I think that's very, very important to constantly be better in capturing the cultural aspect of cognitive neuroscience altogether and developmental processes in particular. Without further ado, Marina, I'm very happy to have you here. Please, we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Lars. Thank you for such a kind introduction, and thank you for all the online audience, for the audience here in person. I'm very, very excited to be here and to be meeting all of you and hearing about all the exciting work that you're doing here. So as Lars said, I come from the Basque Center on Cognition, Brain and Language, and I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit where that is. So we are located in Spain, in the north in Spain, in a very beautiful San Sebastian in the Basque country. This is a very unique location because our population is entirely bilingual. So most of the people in the Basque country speak Spanish and Basque. So we are an institute that is interested in language processing and language acquisition, and we have a very strong focus on bilingualism, taking advantage of this population. And within the institute, I lead the infant language and cognition group, where we study very early stages of language acquisition, also focusing on bilingualism, but also working on understanding how the infant's environment can shape their language acquisition, as Lars mentioned. And most of our studies are done in the Baby Lab at the BCBL, but that's just one of the facilities that we have. We also have EEG for adult studies, eye tracking, NfMRI, and MEG as well. So that allows us to compare techniques across different populations. So if you guys are interested in learning more about the BCBL or the opportunities that we have of visiting or joining us, feel free to reach out to me as well. I'll be happy to talk about it. Okay, so as you probably know or have heard, when we speak with somebody, we tend to dynamically adjust our speech or our speech style, or also known as speech register, according to the communicative needs and also the identity of our interlocutor. So these resulting speech registers or speech styles have unique characteristics that make them more suitable or easier to process for our intended audience. And what I have on the screen are just some examples of these speech registers. So we have non-native directed speech, which we usually use in language teaching situations. So when we speak to people who are non-native speakers of our language, computer directed speech. So when we speak to Alexa or Siri, that's the register that we use. Pet directed speech, also speech in noise or Lombard speech. And my research, and it's in large part, is dedicated to studying one type of speech register, which is infant-directed speech. So infant-directed speech is the special type of speech that we use when we speak with babies. And we usually say that caregivers use infant-directed speech, but actually you don't need to be a caregiver to use it. Most of us, whenever we see a cute baby, we start intuitively and completely automatically using infant-directed speech. So if we compare infant-directed speech, or IDS, to its counterpart, adult-directed speech, or ADS, which is the speech that we typically use with other adults, so the speech that I'm using right now, we see that it has a set of linguistic, acoustic, and also physical characteristics that differentiates the two registers. And it has been proposed that those characteristics serve three primary functions. So the first function is affective. So this means that we use infant-directed speech to soothe and emotionally regulate our infants. The second function is attentive, which means that we use it to attract our infants' attention to interactions with us and keep them engaged. And the third one is linguistic, which means that we may be using infant-directed speech to facilitate the task of language acquisition for our infants. In this last function is what is the focus of my research, but as we will see in the minutes, sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish these three functions of IDS, and it's quite possible that when we use this speech register, we are achieving all of these three functions at the same time. So why do we use infant-directed speech when we speak with babies? So we asked that question in a study that we published in 2017, in which we recorded moms speaking with their babies, but at the same time, we were recording mothers' articulator movements. So you may see on the top image, the mother has little wires coming out of her mouth, and that's because we used electromagnetic articulography to assess the lip, tongue movements of the mom as she was speaking to her baby, when she was speaking to an adult, and also when she was speaking to an adult, but we asked the moms to produce really clear, exaggerated speech. So that's what's shown in green in the graph. In blue, we have adult-directed speech, and in red, infant-directed speech. And what we found is that when mothers were asked to produce this exaggerated, clear speech, they were raising their larynx, but also they were exaggerating the articulator movements. So they were actually hyper-articulating to sound more clear and to convey a clearer speech to their audience. However, when they were speaking to their babies, they were not hyper-articulating, they were not exaggerating their lip or tongue movements, but they were raising their larynx. So what this suggests is that the mothers were modifying the shape of their vocal tract, which usually, and not just in humans, but in some other species as well, leads us to sound smaller, which means that we sound more friendly, non-threatening, and also more similar to the babies themselves who have a small vocal tract and tend to produce this type of vocalizations. When we reduce the size of our vocal tract, that results in a raising in pitch in our vocalization, and also in the expansion of the formants that we produce, so the frequencies of the vowels, which makes our speech also sound clear. So what we concluded is that the moms are not actually intending to sound clearer to teach a language to their infants. They're producing speech that's making them to sound happier and more like closer to their infants. But as a happy accident, that speech is also clear, which, as we evolved the need to learn language, has acquired the secondary function of also assisting infants in the task of learning language. And we also see that infants respond precisely to these affective properties of infant-directed speech. Infants prefer listening to infant-directed compared to adult-directed speech. And it has been suggested that this is precisely driven by the high pitch and exaggerated pitch of this register, which is its prosodic characteristic, and also by the happy speech aspect. So this positive affect that we use when we speak with babies, which makes us sound lovely and happy. And another thing that I should mention is that in the rest of my talk and a lot of this literature, we focus on the acoustics of infant-directed speech. So how does it sound in the auditory modality? But of course, infant-directed communication is multimodal. So whenever we speak with babies, we also tend to exaggerate our facial movements. We tend to move babies in a particular way. We also touch them in an infant-directed manner. And most likely, all of these modalities come together in achieving these functions that I mentioned before. But as I said, even though infant-directed speech may not have evolved to assist language acquisition, we do see some evidence that it does help infants in the difficult task of acquiring their language, especially in the first year of life. So why does this happen? Well, first of all, it has been proposed that IDS may assist early language acquisition because it engages infants' attention to the communicative interaction. So here we go back to the attentive function of infant-directed speech. First of all, it engages infants' attention purely because of the context in which it's usually produced, right? So whenever we produce infant-directed speech, we tend to be in a one-on-one interaction with our infant, which is a high-quality interactive context. So that makes also infants, that facilitates the task of them of attending to the speech that is being produced to them. And there's actually evidence that the amount of words that infants hear in infant-directed speech produced in this high-quality one-on-one interaction type correlates with the later vocabulary size. But it's also the case that the acoustic properties of infant-directed speech actually engage infants' attention more to this type of register. So I mentioned earlier that infants like listening to IDS, but it's not just a preference. We actually see an increase in attention when they hear this type of register. We see some evidence for this from neuroimaging studies that show greater neural activation, especially in the frontal regions, when infants listen to infant-directed compared to adult-directed speech. So this suggests that there is greater neural arousal and also greater readiness to learn when they're presented with this type of register. And there is also evidence for this from numerous language processing tasks that indicate that if infants are presented with infant-directed stimuli compared to adult-directed stimuli, that their performance improves. And we see this in infants from the first month of life up until about 2 years of age, and in very various tasks such as statistical learning, speech segmentation, word recognition, and word learning. So this attentional property of infant-directed speech may assist the infants in focusing on this speech register and extracting linguistic information more successfully from it. But another way in which infant-directed speech may support language acquisition is that its acoustic properties may convert it into the optimal type of signal for facilitating early processing and encoding of speech information. So here we are focusing more on the linguistic aspect of infant-directed speech compared to the attentional one. So first of all, we know that infant-directed speech is slower than adult-directed speech, and this is found across numerous languages. So the fact that our speech rate decreases when we speak to babies is already showing that we are producing speech that is clear, because low speech rate is a correlate of clear speech. And we're also just given more time for our infants to encode the information that we are transmitting to them. But another property of infant-directed speech that may make it more optimal for encoding is that it is a rhythmically more regular signal compared to adult-directed speech. And we showed some evidence for this in this study led by Vicky Leon, in which we used computational modeling to deconstruct the amplitude structure of infant-directed and adult-directed speech recordings. So what I'm showing you here on the graph on the y-axis are what we call phase synchronization indices, or PSIs. So what this analysis does is that it takes recordings of speech and it deconstructs its amplitude modulation envelope into different frequency rates that correspond to the rates at which meaningful information is being transferred in the speech signal. So here specifically, we're interested in the rates of theta and delta, which correspond to the rates at which the syllables and stressed syllables are conveyed in speech. Okay? And what we will see in the x-axis of this figure is the acoustic frequency from the speech signal from which these amplitude rates are being extracted. So as you already can see, the main differences between the condition are clustered around the low frequency information. So that's the prosodic information in speech. And as you can see on the figure in the purple line, I'm showing adult-directed speech. And in the colored lines, we have infant-directed speech directed to infants at different ages. And what we see is that the phase synchronization index is significantly higher for infant compared to adult-directed speech. What this means is that there is greater synchronization, greater regularity in the timing in which syllables and stressed syllables occur in the speech. And this greater regularity increases the regularity in the timing with which this signal is produced, which leads to the conclusion that infant-directed speech has more regular timing or more regular rhythm compared to adult-directed speech. Now, we know from prior literature that this type of regularity and this type of prosodic information is what infants rely on in order to start the task of segmenting continuous speech into meaningful units. So this led us to ask whether this greater regularity would also mean that infants find it easier to process and encode information from infant-directed speech compared to adult-directed speech. Now, when we're talking about encoding information from continuous speech, the mechanism that we were interested in assessing is cortical tracking of speech. And of course, I think that this audience knows this topic very well. So apologies if I'm giving you some definitions that are obvious for you. But when we talk about cortical tracking of speech, we are talking about the process by which endogenous neural activity synchronizes with the information in the amplitude modulation envelope of speech. And we know that the temporal rates at which endogenous neural activity occurs match roughly the temporal rates at which meaningful linguistic information is carried in the speech signal. So we can specifically for speech processing, the rates that are relevant is the phonological rate, which corresponds to the gamma rate of neural oscillations, the syllabic rate, which corresponds to the theta rate of neural oscillations, and lexical and phrasal rates, which correspond to delta in neural oscillations. And there's now ample evidence with adults and also children that shows that it's the simultaneous synchronization between the neural activity and the amplitude envelope modulations at all of these rates that allows for successful processing and encoding of speech and even correlates with successful speech comprehension. So knowing all of this and also knowing that cortical tracking of speech can be influenced by both top-down and bottom-up information, we predicted that greater attention to speech and greater rhythmic regularity in the speech signal should predict an enhancement in cortical tracking. And based on everything that I've been saying so far, a speech type that engages attention and that has greater rhythmic regularity is infant-directed speech. So we predicted that there should be better cortical tracking of infant-directed compared to adult-directed speech. And we set out to test this with 7-month-old infants who are acquiring English. And to test cortical tracking of speech, we presented infants with a naturally produced infant-directed speech and adult-directed speech recordings, which each lasting for about 5 minutes. And the recordings were of a mother who was speaking to her own baby, and then we took that recording and played it to other babies. And we applied temporal response function analysis. And what we found is that there was only significant cortical tracking of infant-directed and not adult-directed speech, which was according to our prediction. And of course, as you'll probably know very well, there's another recent study that extended this finding even further by Katarina, who recorded cortical tracking to infant and adult-directed speech to 9-month-olds learning German, and found also more efficient cortical tracking to infant-directed compared to adult-directed speech, but in this case, specifically in the stress rate, so in the delta rate, which means that the cortical tracking that we're seeing in response to infant-directed speech may be related to the prosodic information, to the prosodic exaggeration in this register. And the delta rate is particularly interesting here, given that infants will listen to German, which is a stressed timed language. So given all of these findings, the next question that I started thinking about is whether this effect of infant-directed speech that we see on cortical tracking is modulated by infants' age and language experience in any way. So these previous studies focused on infants between 7 and 9 months of age, which are ages when infants are already beginning to segment continuous speech and encoding words and more detailed linguistic information from the speech signal. So we asked whether we would also see a benefit in cortical tracking in much younger infants who have not started segmenting speech yet. So for this purpose, in this recent study, we recorded cortical tracking to speech in infants who are acquiring Basque. There's a monolingual, infants raised in a monolingual Basque environment. And we recorded their neural activity at 4 and 9 months. So this is a longitudinal study. So infants contributed data at both ages. And we recorded their neural responses when they were listening to 10 minutes of infant-directed speech and 10 minutes of adult-directed speech. In this case, we used simulated infant-directed speech. So a person was asked to read a story, pretending as if she were speaking to a baby, and then as if she were speaking to an adult. And then we assessed speech-brain coherence, but note that in this study, we were interested in the theta band of neural activations. And the reason for this is because Basque is a syllable-timed language. So the regularity with which syllables occur in the language is relevant for infants' acquisition of the prosodic structure of this language. And what we find is, again, only a main effect of speech register and no effect of infant's age and no interaction between register and age. So this suggests to us that infants show more efficient cortical tracking of infant-directed speech already at 4 months, and we see this continuing at 9 months of age. So this effect does not seem to be dependent on infant's age, at least in this study. We also looked at whether infants' cortical tracking to the at the two ages was related, and we see a very moderate correlation between their cortical tracking at 4 and 9 months in response to infant-directed speech. However, when we also look at this correlation for the responses to adult-directed speech, we see that there is no relation at all. So the cortical tracking to infant-directed speech seems to be a little bit more consistent across the two ages, possibly suggesting that infants are processing the linguistic structure of infant-directed speech, which is not happening in the case of adult-directed speech at all. So as I mentioned before, and taking this new data into consideration, I think we can conclude that infant-directed speech facilitates cortical tracking of speech in the first year of life. And it appears that this effect of infant-directed speech may be facilitative for not only speech segmentation later on, but also for the early acquisition of the prosodic structure of their native language, because we're seeing this effect, this positive effect of infant-directed speech as early as at 4 months of age. We also see that cortical tracking of infant-directed speech seems to have some consistency across the ages, which is also interesting because we are now seeing some research showing that individual indices of cortical tracking of infant-directed speech predict later language outcomes. So it is possible that this higher efficiency of encoding infant-directed speech may remain consistent across the first year and become a significant predictor of individual differences in language development. But of course, we need to continue obtaining data that actually tests this directly. And it also appears that the fact that we find a benefit of infant-directed speech for cortical tracking at 4 months means that this mechanism may be assisting infants in learning the rhythmic structure of their language. And there is only one study to date that has looked at oscillatory activity comparing infants' responses to native and a non-native language. And there is an indication that there are differences in oscillatory activity, but so far they have not looked at actual cortical tracking indices. And that's something that we are working on in my lab at the moment. Now, I was talking about what aspects of infant-directed speech could be leading to these positive effects. And of course, previous research has suggested that it is its prosodic structure, and most likely that is the case. However, I want to argue that it is also possible that the linguistic structure of infant-directed speech, so the speech clarity aspect of it, could also be contributing to this effect that we're seeing. So far, this has not been tested directly in infants, but we have a study in our lab where we are looking at cortical tracking of speech by language learners. So when non-native listeners are listening to the language that they are learning in the moment, and we are presenting them with clear speech, so non-native directed clear speech compared to normal adult directed speech equivalent, and we see more efficient cortical tracking in response to clear speech, suggesting that this aspect of the speech signal could be enhancing cortical tracking as well. But of course, as I said, there is still a need to test this directly in infants. Okay, So we're moving on from cortical tracking, and now we're going to look at another reason why infant-directed speech may be an optimal signal for early language acquisition. And now I'm focusing exactly on this property of clear speech. This is what suggests that infant-directed speech may be optimal for assisting infants to learn phonetic categories of their native language. Now, I've already alluded to this throughout my talk, where I talked about the fact that when parents produce infant-directed speech, we see an exaggeration in the vowel formats that they produce. But now I can define it in a bit more detail. And this refers to the characteristic of phonetic exaggeration in infant-directed speech. So when parents address their infants, they tend to produce vowels that are acoustically more exaggerated than when they speak in adult-directed speech. And what we do to measure this is that we record instances of what we know as corner vowels in infant-directed and adult-directed speech. Corner vowels are E, U, and R, and they're called corner vowels because they delimit the vowel space in a language, so they're positioned at the corners. So if we extract the first and second formants of these vowel productions and plot them in two-dimensional space, what we end up with is with a vowel triangle. And what we see consistently across several studies is that the triangle for infant-directed speech is significantly larger than for adult-directed speech. So what this means is that caregivers, most likely unconsciously, produce these exaggerated vowels, which expand the acoustic space of the speech that they're producing, thus resulting in clearer speech and also in vowel categories that are more distinct and therefore easier for the infants to discriminate and possibly later even learn how to reproduce them in their own vocal tract. Now, we already have some evidence that shows that the extent to which individual mothers exaggerate vowels in their speech correlates with language outcomes in their infant. So this has been shown for infants in the first year of life, where there is a correlation between mother's degree of vowel exaggeration and infants' performance in behavioral phoneme discrimination tasks. And also correlations between mother's degree of vowel hyperarticulation and infants' vocabulary size in the second year of life. There is now also some evidence that these correlations may extend even further in development. And we actually also see some evidence for this in our own data. So here I'm showing you some data from a longitudinal study where we've recorded infant-directed speech when infants were from 9 to 19 months of age, but then we continued following up these children, and when they turned 5 years of age or 60 months, we tested their phonological abilities. And what we see is that vowel hyperarticulation, which we show on the x-axis in the two graphs, significantly correlates with infants' phonological awareness and phonological memory scores on a standardized test. Now, of course, these correlations are moderate, but nonetheless, they are significant, indicating that possibly the type of input that infants receive in the first years of life also has consequences for their phonological development early on, but also reflected in their phonological skills before they start school. But one thing that we need to keep in mind is that we should always take these correlational results with caution, because whenever we look at correlations between maternal behavior and infants' outcomes, we could be seeing influences of other variables that we cannot account for in our designs. So partially, there could be some genetic reasons for why mothers who speak more clearly also have children who develop better language abilities, but also there could be some other interactional factors that we're not capturing in our acoustic analysis. So in order to dig further into this, we started to look at how infants actually process vowels produced in infant versus adult-directed speech. So one study in which we already started to look into that was this study by my former student, Irina Lovchevich, who looked at how 18-month-olds recognize words when the words are said with two types of speech. So this study actually did not include infant-directed speech, but instead Irina designed two speech registers, one which sounded very much like adult-directed speech, but had exaggerated vowels as infant-directed speech would, and another one that sounded very much like infant-directed speech, so it was happy and variable, but it did not have exaggerated vowels. And in this type of tasks, infants are shown pairs of objects like a shoe in a car, and they hear a voice saying, "Where is the car?" And we record for how long they look at the car using eye tracking. And what I'm showing in the graph are different scores. So this is the difference between the proportion of time that the kids looked at the correct object versus the incorrect object after hearing its name. And we see that children perform significantly better in the condition that had exaggerated vowels. So this study is already indicating to us that the vowel hyperarticulation component is more important than the exaggerated prosody in assisting infants in processing the speech that they're hearing. But of course, this study is with 18-month-old infants, and the task is word recognition, so it doesn't tell us much about how vowel processing is happening at the very early stages of language development, which is what we did look for in our next set of studies. So first, we wanted to ask, how do infants process vowels that are produced in infant-directed speech versus adult-directed speech without looking at the vowel discrimination component? So in this study, we recruited 9-month-old infants who were acquiring English, and we recorded their brain activity using EEG in an auditory audible paradigm. And the paradigm was constructed as it is shown on the screen. So we had two within subjects conditions. In one condition, infants heard the standard stimulus, which was in adult-directed speech. And it was an instance of a vowel E naturally produced by a mother speaking to an adult. And the deviant was an E produced by the same mother, but when she was speaking to a baby. So I will refer to this as the IDS deviant condition. And the other condition was the opposite. The standard was in infant-directed speech, and the deviant was in adult-directed speech. Right? So we compared infants' performance in the IDS deviant and the ADS deviant conditions. Now, before I go into showing the results of this study, there is one consideration that we need to keep in mind when looking at infants' performance in this type of audible paradigms. And again, it will be very familiar to some people in the audience, and we've been discussing this already this morning. So here in this type of audible paradigms, we're looking for a mismatch response, right? If we were testing adults, the ERP component that we would be aiming to see is the mismatch negativity. In infant studies, however, this component can be manifested in two different ways. It could be manifested with the adult-like negative polarity, which is the MMN, or it could be manifested with a positive polarity, which we call the mismatch response. Now, the field is still debating what drives these differences in responses and what kind of factors could be influencing whether a child shows an MMN or an MMR. But in terms of language processing, one conclusion that we've arrived to is that the positive or less mature response is reflective of less mature language processing, of effortful processing that requires greater attention to the stimuli, and also processing at the acoustic level. Whereas the more adult-like MMN may be showing more mature processing, also more automatic processing that does not require so much attention and effort, and may already showing some kind of phonetic abstraction and rather than acoustic processing. And what is interesting when we think about these types of responses with different polarities is that it is not the case that infants up to a certain age only show one type of response and then transition to another. Both responses can coexist in the same infant, but manifest differently depending on the stimuli that we present to them. So in keeping this in mind, let's look at the results of our study. So what we found in this study is that we saw a cluster of statistically significant mismatch responses only for difference of standard versus deviant, only for infant-directed and not for adult-directed speech. But most importantly, these were in the negative polarity. So when infants were listening to the standard of adult-directed speech, and then when they heard the deviant in infant-directed speech, they showed the mature mismatch negativity response. With later latency, we do see in a mismatch response a positive response, now in both conditions, in the IDS deviant condition and in the ADS deviant condition. So we believe that these results suggest that the infants were detecting the change in register in both conditions. However, they are showing more automatic processing when the deviant is in their more familiar, in the prosodically exaggerated infant-directed speech compared to adult-directed speech. And this is why we only see a mismatch negativity response when IDS is the deviant. Now, we thought that these results could be interesting in showing us how infants are starting to process infant-directed speech differentially from adult-directed speech. But of course, in this study, we didn't look at whether infant-directed speech helps infants to discriminate different vowel categories in their native language. And that's what we decided to do next. So these are some new data that we have not published yet. But here we looked at two groups of infants, 4-month-olds and 9-month-olds, and these are also infants acquiring English. Now, we chose these two age groups for a reason. So we know that throughout the first year of an infant's life, they go through the process of phonological attunement, where there is a significant increase in their ability to discriminate native phonetic categories and a decrease in their ability to discriminate non-native phonetic categories. Usually we say that this process of phonological attunement tends to be completed towards the first year of a child's life. But we also know that phonological attunement for vowels happens much earlier, and it tends to be completed by about 6 months of age. So we decided to test infants at 4 months, which is when they're going through the process of phonological attunement for vowels, and then at 9 months when we expect them to be fully completed with this process. And in this case, again, we extracted vowels from natural speech that a mom produced when she was speaking to her baby. But this time we extracted vowels E and A. And we constructed two conditions for, again, an auditory oddball paradigm that we recorded using EEG. So in an infant-directed speech condition, all vowels were extracted from infant-directed speech. The standard was the vowel A and the deviant was the vowel E. And in the adult-directed speech condition, same vowels, but now extracted from a recording of adult-directed speech. So first, I'm showing you the results of the 4-month-old group. And what we find here is that when infants were completing the infant-directed speech condition, we see a significant mismatch negativity response to the two vowels. But we don't see a negative response in the adult-directed speech condition. However, we do get a later response, so in later latency, that is positive, and MMR in response to the two conditions, infant-directed and adult-directed speech. So again, this goes in line with our initial interpretation that when infants are listening to vowels in infant-directed speech, we see this more mature response, which is already manifesting at 4 months of age. However, they're also detecting the acoustic difference between the two vowels in adult-directed speech, which is manifested in this later positive response for both registers. And when we look at the 9-month-old data here, it's also as we predicted, because here we see the negative mismatch negativity response in both registers. So 9-month-olds show a mismatch negativity response when listening to vowels in infant and in adult-directed speech. Interestingly, we also see a later mismatch response, but only in the infant-directed speech condition. I can talk about this later during questions if you wish. We see something similar when we record adults as well. So it could be an attentional response to this prosodically exaggerated register. But for the sake of this talk, I want to focus on the mismatch negativity response, which in 4-month-olds only emerged for infant-directed speech, but at 9 months of age, it's emergent for the two registers. So in these two studies, we see that there is mature discrimination of infant and adult-directed speech signal at 9 months of age, when, especially when infants have to differentiate infant from adult-directed speech, when infant-directed speech is the deviant. And we also see more mature discrimination of vowels when they're produced in infant-directed speech compared to adult-directed speech. So in terms of the different polarities of the responses that we see, I think that these results suggest that infants' brain maturation is, of course, contributing to the polarity that we're seeing in the results, but also the type of input, the type of stimuli that we're giving them, which represent the type of input that they hear in their daily interactions with their caregivers, is influencing the maturity of the response that we see, and also probably the level of processing that we are seeing. Now, again, in the study, we used naturalistic stimuli. So these were vowels that were extracted from moms naturally interacting with their babies. So again, we're not able to specifically say whether it is the vowel exaggeration component that is driving these responses or the exaggerated pitch in this stimuli. But we argue that most likely, again, the two are acting in unison to support infants' performance because the two also appear naturally in the type of interactions in which they engage with their caregivers. But most importantly, we think that these results could suggest that in the acoustic properties of infant-directed speech may facilitate the onset of phonological attunement in the first year of life by assisting infants in the discrimination, at least of vowel categories in their native language, but possibly of other categories as well. Okay, so in my talk, I've showed you that infant-directed speech elicits different types of neural responses in young infants compared to adult-directed speech. And we've seen this in evidence for more efficient neural tracking of continuous speech and also more mature neural indices for speech sound encoding and speech discrimination. And we also see that these effects can be observed in infants from about 4 months to about 9 months of age. And we've shown this across different tasks and across different language groups. So this suggests to us that infants' endogenous sensory system is responsive to the acoustic properties that their caregivers naturally produce in the speech that they address to infants. And I hope that this helps my argument that infant-directed speech is an optimal signal for encoding and processing continuous speech by very young language learners. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for the inspiring presentation, Marina.
Thank you.
You want to call up the questions yourself?
Sure. So just jump in. I don't know how questions on Zoom.
Yeah, maybe just.
Oh, okay. Yes. And just unmute yourself, Kanat.
Hi, Marina.
Hi.
Excellent talk. So I had one quick question, which was that in all of the IDS work that you've presented so far, what was the control condition, if there was any? Because in typical sort of adult neuroscience literature, you typically use backward speech as a control condition. So I was wondering whether the spectral contents of the speech, the exaggerated prosody, is that what is driving the increased synchronization, or is it the linguistic information as well?
Yes, that's a really good point. So that's why I'm very cautious in not making an argument of whether it's the linguistic information or the prosodic exaggeration, because so far our control condition is always adult-directed speech, but of course there is this confound. So our initial set of studies were aimed at differentiating responses to infant versus adult-directed speech. But it's true that in the work that we're doing now, where we're already building on these studies, we are using either a backward speech condition or also, depending on the age of the infants, an infant-directed speech condition, but in an unfamiliar language. So a language that differs in the prosodic structure from the native language. And we're using that in the studies that we're running now to, as you say, exactly dissociate whether the effect that we're seeing is driven by the linguistic properties.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Maybe also check the second page on the second page on Zoom.
But I think if they raise their hands, they jump to the beginning. Wow. Oh yeah, Maya. Technology. Oh, we can't hear you because you're muted there.
Yeah. Hi, Marina. Thank you so much for your talk. I was interested in the vowels because you were talking about vowel hyperarticulation. How much do you control for vowel duration when you speak about the vowel space? Because you get like these vowel space expansions or more variability in the vowel space. You also get in older speakers when they speak in context. But when you let them read word lists, the differences between younger and older speakers disappear. So it seems to be like in older speakers speech, it seems to be an effect of the temporal structure of the sequence. Do you control for vowel duration when you
Yes.
look at?
So in the EEG studies, we controlled for vowel duration to make sure that the infant-directed and adult-directed speech vowels didn't differ. When we measure vowel exaggeration in natural infant-directed speech, we also use vowel duration as a factor to make sure that the register difference is not just due to vowel duration, and the difference in formants still is significant. So I think that, so of course, longer vowels are also a key characteristic of clear.
Yeah.
Right. But I think that this is due to in part to the speech production evidence that I showed, that adult speakers tend to exaggerate their speech with different articulatory strategies compared to when we speak to infants. So when we speak to infants, we reach higher formants by this raising of our larynx and producing higher pitch. Whereas when we speak to adults, we reach clear vowels by exaggerating our movements, elongating the vowels more. So there, the duration and the formant exaggeration go more hand in hand. I hope. Yeah.
Yeah, I just, I was catching up. Yeah. I get it. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, Claudia.
I loved your talk.
Oh, thank you.
It's okay.
No, it's not. You alluded to cross-linguistic differences already for the cortical tracking study, and you showed the rate, the frequency band that is motivated from the rhythmic class of Basque. However, I was wondering whether you did the full contrast, also looking at slower rates to see whether independent of the features of the input, there is a general difference, because you haven't seen the difference between IDS and ADS, which you should, if you know syllable, the syllable rate is the driving force for your younger or older infants, which is not. Have you also looked at the slower rate, just to see whether there shows up a preference for the slower rate as we found it, because slow is good per se?
Yeah, so I didn't show it here because we're still figuring out different ways of analyzing the data, but in this analysis that we're doing, it's not showing up at delta. It's true that we initially predicted that it should be at theta because of the Basque structure. But I mean, reading more of the recent work by Katarina, and also I thought, well, then maybe it shows up in both. But in this data set, as of now, I'm not seeing it in delta. And I also think it's interesting because whenever you look at the amplitude modulation, the way we showed it for English with Vicky in her study, there is now evidence for it in Spanish, which is also syllable based. And you also see the phase synchronization index for delta and theta. So there seems to be that the amplitude modulation is similar across languages. It's only 2 studies, but that's what's suggested. So that could indicate that we should see also better tracking at delta in Basque, but we're not seeing it now.
Okay.
So I wish I could show you more data, but COVID kind of ruined our plans. So yeah. What we are doing now, and what I'm really hoping to show soon, is a longitudinal study where babies are listening to Basque and Spanish, so 2 syllable languages, but are native or non-native, depending on the infant, and also English, where we know kind of the amplitude modulation structure a bit better, but it's their non-native language. So here I'm trying to target these language classes, but also start getting at language specificity in these effects. So yeah, it's ongoing. We've got half of the sample, so hopefully at the next conference I'll have something to show.
Looking forward to
Yeah.
the data.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah, I also really liked it.
thank you.
I was wondering, so you already mentioned that you could still do it, but why you think you don't find an MMR for the 9-month-olds in that assay that you
Yes, yeah. So what I alluded to is that in the initial study where we compared responses to infant-directed deviance versus adult-directed deviance, we also tested adults. And adults showed a mismatch negativity in both conditions. But when infant-directed speech was the deviant, they also showed this later positivity. So something very similar to kind of P300, right? So we were a bit surprised by it, to be honest, but we kind of interpreted and saying, sometimes you see this recovery of attention, especially when the deviant is very much unexpected, which for adults, infant-directed speech is. And we actually see this in adult studies. So when we record cortical tracking to infant-directed speech in adults, we also see that they are less efficient. So this mismatch between the register and what they're expected to hear is affecting their processing. In adults is a little bit for a different reason, but there is an attentional component to it. So that's why we think that while both infant and adult-directed speech vowels got the MMN at 9 months, only infant-directed speech shows this later positive attentional response. Right. We think that it's due to the same reason, but it's true that it's something that we probably need to try and test separately. It wasn't the component of interest, but it's coming up across studies. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question. Thank you so much for your thoughts.
Thank you.
As again, everyone said, but I heard a lot of things. So my question is sort of, I know that IDS is a common trait, like across a lot of cultures, but there's also certain cultural groups that don't use IDS. So do you know if there's any way to eliminate like familiarity effects on potentially being a reason for these infants that come from cultures where I think traditionally people use IDS and have increased cortical tracking with IDS?
Yes, so this is a really tricky factor, right? Because babies, that's what they listen to. It's true that babies are familiar with adult-directed speech as well, because we do use it a lot around them, right? Whenever we speak with other adults in the home and holding the baby, we're using IDS. But it's not the same level of familiarity with infant-directed speech. So there are two parts to this. It is the case that there are some cultures where infant-directed speech is not used, or a more accurate way of saying it, it is manifested in different ways, right? So in some cultures, parents still adjust the way they speak to babies, but not in the exaggerated manner in which we record in Western countries. There is still very little research on it, but there's some exciting work coming up now showing that maybe these kids are receiving other types of input that could assist their language development. So for example, they tend to receive a lot of sibling or other children's input. So they may be learning very different kind of interactions, but still getting something that they need. In terms of how to control for the familiarity, it's impossible if you are recruiting typical infant populations. There are some conditions in which infant-directed speech is different to the one that we typically describe. So for example, infants of depressed caregivers, right? So there is still infant-directed speech, but it tends to lack the high prosody and the prosodic variation component. There are some studies with those kids, and what's interesting is that in those studies, when they look at whether infant-directed speech assists processing, they don't find the effect. So it sounds like if the baby is not receiving this input from early on, they do not know how to extract this benefit from the infant-directed speech. The infants, well, at least we argue in our research, the infants learn to elicit the type of infant-directed speech that they like listening to. So these infants also do not elicit it from other caregivers. So it seems like there is a critical time point where this learning by the infant and by the caregiver takes place. Right? But there is this one population that I can think of that could be used to test interesting contrasts. Yes, another question on Zoom. Irina?
Hi, Marina. Thank you for conducting such difficult studies. My question has to do with the third component you mentioned, that is the linguistic properties of infant-directed speech. So can you say anything about whether there is any cortical tracking of syntactic structure, if we assume that parents are using simplified syntax, or if they're doing things like, pausing in suprasegmental structures, anything beyond phonetics and phonology?
So far, there is nothing on that, but it's certainly the next step for us to look at. It is true that sentences tend to be simpler and shorter in infant-directed speech. So that is certainly affecting the type of infant that infants are receiving. And it is proposed to also facilitate morphosyntactic learning. I hope that we will be able to dive a little bit deeper into that. We were discussing this earlier as well. The population that we work with are Basque Spanish bilinguals. So these are two languages with drastically opposing syntactic structures. So we are recording cortical tracking in this case. It's true that we are focusing on prosody and phonology, but the data set will be there. And I hope that in the future, we'll be able to look at it. But as of now, there are no studies come to mind that have looked at that.
Okay, thank you. Good luck with that.
Thank you. Right. Maya has another.
Maya.
Yes, Maya.
Me again. I had another one on these differences between IDS and adult-directed speech. Has anyone ever looked at speech tracking of speech produced by other children?
I don't think so, right?
You will do it soon.
Yeah.
Good idea.
In an unpublished study that we did with Dennis Burnham in Australia, we recorded children speaking to babies and also to a robot and then to an adult. So there are two conditions where they had to exaggerate vowels. And we found that they did exaggerate vowels and prosody when speaking to the baby and also to the robot, which was a very cute baby-like robot. But it's data that just never made it to the writing stage because one of the authors retired and another one moved on. But that's as far as we went to, but no cortical tracking studies. So that's an interesting thing to do.
Because I was thinking that it actually in cultures where the infant-directed speech is used less, it could be that the kids are actually picking up the task of teaching other kids to speak.
Exactly. And another factor to it is that there is evidence that babies attend more to infant-directed speech, but they actually attend more to speech produced with these small vocal tracts that are more similar to their own. So it is quite possible that speech produced by another child is even more attractive and attention-getting for an infant.
Cool. Thank
So
you.
definitely an interesting idea. Lars.
I have a question, and it's a bit Trubetskoian. Sorry.
Nice.
When you showed the dwarfed vowel space with the two formants, formant axes, can you show
The triangle, you mean?
Yeah, the triangle.
No.
I want to make
This,
sure that,
yes.
Okay, yes, okay, I can ask it. So this is not symmetric. So
No.
the exaggeration is not symmetric. So I was wondering, why? What's the constraint on this? Is it a noise constraint intrinsic to language because there's more competition in those parts, so you have to make those vowels more distinctive? Is it an articulatory constraint because you cannot go so far with the shoe, it's hard to go further than that? Or is it even, and this is now the Trubetskoy part, is it even an articulatory constraint in the babbling? So is there work on the particular phonemes that are adult first. I mean, it's a complex story, and it's also related to probably the cranial nerves and the development of the muscles and so on and so forth. Is there work on that? And like, that's kind of extending on that question, reminds me of discussions that Katarina and I had. Can you see that in the frequency of specific phonemes in infant directed speech? Or are all phonemes present at the same frequency as we find them in adult directed speech? And just based on that plot, I would predict that that's not the case. There's only certain vowels and certain sounds that you can push further away based on certain hard constraints of articulation.
Yes. So yeah, this is a question we've been thinking a lot about. So first, I do not know enough about babbling to give an answer, but I do know, and these vowels that we pick, so they're the 3 corner vowels, they're the most common across languages in the world, and they tend to be very early acquired, right? So in terms of the vowels that a baby could be babbling in, they should be appearing very early on. They're also quite high frequency. I do think that there should be some articulatory constraints because first, because of the way we produce speech, but also if you exaggerate more one of the formants, you could move into an unnatural vowel category that could be confounded with another one or is not hitting the target, right? So that's counterproductive. But one thing that is worth keeping in mind is that whenever we plot the triangles, we're averaging across the area spaces of many months. And if you look at specific papers, there is usually some kind of asymmetry. Sometimes it's even shifting, right? So it could also be a byproduct. So for example, really cool analysis by Titia Benders, she was arguing that we're seeing more of the shifting in the second format, which is because we smile when we speak to babies. And when we do this, we also affect in our vocal tract. In our EMMA study, we controlled so we were measuring the vocal tract from the larynx while controlling for the oo and e sounds, but it's also possible that it's all affecting it. So I think it's a confluence of your articulatory, but linking it to infant productions. It's interesting because, and this is the last point in response to this question, because the very, very first studies on vowel hyperarticulation were arguing that it appears from the onset. So as soon as you're starting to produce infant directed speech, you're hyperarticulating. But the more and more we're looking at different data sets, it seems like hyperarticulation strengthens with time. And usually we argue that it's because the baby is at the stage of language acquisition when they're starting to ask for it. But what is ask for it? And probably babbling is one of the things that they are producing.
Like, what are they actually asking for? Something that they can hear, something that they can comprehend, or something that they can produce themselves. Right?
Exactly. And we speak more to babies as soon as they start producing. So, there's a shark, right? So that's the typical interaction, and it corresponds very nicely with the stages of speech production development.
It's kind of, sorry, the last question. I was thinking the same thing when I saw your MMN stimuli. Did you counterbalance the A and the I, so the standard and the deviant?
In this study, we did not, but that's something that I now know we should have done.
Yeah, you could see a surprise. And combined with that vowel space, I would guess that it makes a difference actually.
Yeah.
With the deviants.
Yeah, if we do follow-ups, I'd like to counterbalance it, but then also to try with other contrasts. So E and A are very different in space. So we could try E and U, or even introduce some intermediate vowels, although there is a lot of debate about what infant directed speech does to intermediate vowels. So we're first recording them in moms to understand what happens and then start using them as stimuli.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so we're deviating from our sheep shoeing shock and introducing more toys into the mix.
Okay. If you have more questions online or in the room, I can see behind me. Doesn't seem to be the case. Marina, thank you very much again.
Thank you.